Hello, everyone, and welcome to No Drop. This is part 2 of our series on cycling logistics. And on this episode, I really want to focus on nutrition. Nutrition is such a vast topic, and we could spend dozens of hours talking about how to approach nutrition and all the considerations that you need to make when choosing foods and how to implement them into your workout. On this episode, though, I really just want to cover the foundation of how to approach nutrition when you're on the bike. And specifically, that's going to focus on two main goals. Then, in order to achieve those goals, we're going to dive deeper into three different areas of nutrition. Then we'll talk about how to use a health-first approach when you're fueling for your activity. We'll talk about how to address the timing of nutrition. And finally, we'll talk about some transportation considerations and some ideas of how to choose foods that are packable and are easy to bike with. Before we dive into this episode, I just want to say that nutrition is one of my favorite areas. I have spent so much time learning about nutrition and also experimenting about nutrition to find out what really works for me. And it's an area that has probably benefited my cycling arguably more than any other area, including training. So nutrition is very important, and the way that we get energy is really, really critical, especially as the distance of cycling that we want to accomplish increases. So let's start to look at these two main goals that we have for nutrition. My two main goals are one, to fuel my workout, and two, to fuel my body. And how are those two things different? Because they sound basically the same, right? Well, the difference is when we're thinking about fueling our workout, we're really just looking at how do we keep our muscles going? How do we just keep the movement, the activity going? When we're talking about fueling our body, now we're talking about how do we fuel everything else? And that is mainly going to come with just building healthy eating habits. You know, within fueling our workout, we can primarily do that just by focusing on carbohydrates and maybe a couple other things. But your body needs so many other nutrients to thrive. And that is where fueling our body and start making that a priority is going to become really, really important. In order to achieve those two goals, we can break that down into three different areas of nutrition that we need to address. The first area is energy expenditure. So that is predominantly looking at fueling our workout. We can look at mineral expenditure. Mineral expenditure addresses how do we get the salts that we need in order for our body to keep operating, for our nervous system, for our cooling system to continue operating. And the third is this idea of basal expenditure. And that's where we're looking at fueling our body. Basal expenditure is My biggest priority when I'm thinking about how do I fuel myself on the bike, it's the topic I'm most passionate about. So that's the one I want to dive into first and start to analyze what sorts of considerations do we need to make to address those three areas, and how do each of those areas benefit our cycling. With basal expenditure, essentially what we're addressing is that the body does not run on carbohydrates alone. Carbs are a great way to address your energy expenditure, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But for basal expenditure, we're really thinking of what kind of vitamins do we need to get? What kind of fats do we need to be intaking? How can we meet our omega-3 intake while we're riding? We're really looking at foods that have a bigger variety of nutrients. My goal is overall health and longevity. And so, in order to pursue those things, when I'm riding a lot, I really try to look at just more conventional, quote unquote, healthy foods, things that have more than just carbohydrates and salts in order to fuel myself and build a connection to health. Basal expenditure might be a new consideration for some people to think about when they're thinking about riding their bike and bringing food. But fortunately, it's not a very complicated area. We can really address this with, kind of more whole and complete foods. Some foods that I use on the bike in order to address the requirements of basal expenditure would be sprouted grain breads, very nutrient diverse, meal replacement powders, which could be a brand like Ensure or Huel. These are powders that are made to replace meals. So they have a huge variety of nutrients in them to really give your body everything that it needs to survive and to thrive. And the last thing, something that has been a absolute game changer in my riding, has been using cooked rice on my rides. And one last thing I'll say about basal expenditure is the great thing about choosing foods that address your basal expenditure is that those foods will also fulfill mineral expenditure and energy expenditure requirements. So by making this the very base of our pyramid and making it the foundation of how we eat, we've made great progress to these other areas that we need to be conscious of as we're exercising. The second area of nutrition to consider in order to achieve our goals is mineral expenditure. As you exercise, and especially as you exercise in hot weather, your body uses a ton of minerals. And there are 4 minerals that we can focus on in order to best fuel our workout. And those are sodium, magnesium, potassium, and calcium. If you have a product like Scratch or some sort of other hydration mix, you'll probably find these 4 minerals included in that mix. And the reason for that is that these minerals are essential for your body to function. They help your muscles function. They help your body retain water. They help your body cool itself. They help your nervous system. They help your cardiovascular system. So we do need to be very conscious of keeping these minerals as part of our nutrition strategy. The way that I address mineral expenditure predominantly is through the use of hydration powders, or what I'll call performance-driven nutrition powders. Those would be products like Tailwind or ESN is another one, where they're providing you with optimized carbohydrates, and then on top of that, providing you with all those minerals that you need in order to keep functional in your exercise. My final consideration as I'm looking to train or as I'm looking to perform is energy expenditure and addressing the energy your body is actually consuming within a workout. One important aspect of energy expenditure is that you're almost always burning more than you can consume. So within a workout, on the low end, you could be burning around 400 calories per hour, and that could go all the way up to 700 calories per hour. It could be more for extremely hard efforts or efforts that take place in very hot weather. And when I'm looking to fuel my workouts and fulfill those energy expenditure requirements, I am mostly looking for foods that are easy to digest and typically in the form of carbohydrates. These carbohydrates could be processed. Often they are what we would consider as unhealthy foods, highly processed foods, packaged foods. So, some examples of energy expenditure foods could be candy, it could be performance products like gels, performance mixes, so powders that you mix in with a water, things like soda, Pop-Tarts, baked goods, just different processed foods that really all they're giving us is calories, what are called macronutrients. So these are going to be sources of carbohydrates, maybe some fat, and maybe some protein, and that's about it. So we're not really considering vitamins or minerals with a lot of these foods. The reason I put energy expenditure last is that by stacking energy expenditure foods on top of those basal expenditure foods and on top of those mineral expenditure considerations, by making this the area of nutrition that I'm focusing on the least, it means I'm consuming the least amount of candy. It means I'm drinking the least amount of soda, the fewest number of Pop-Tarts. So in my pursuit to just build overall healthy nutrition habits, this is one that I like to focus on the least and put the healthier choices first. With all those three areas of nutrition considerations, there is a very important concept of being consistent. And this brings us to how do we time our nutrition? As I said, with energy expenditure, we are almost always working at a calorie deficit if we're working out. So to be consistent with our eating is really, really crucial. If you're exercising and burning about 500 calories per hour, Let's say you do that for 3 hours. Now you've burnt 1,500 calories. There is no way to work yourself out of that deficit without taking a very long rest to let your body digest. So the idea of consistency allows us to fuel our body in real time. And we can push these deficits off for longer and longer and longer, which means we can ride for longer and longer. My rule when I'm riding is I'm starting before I get hungry. So really on every ride that I do, maybe 15, 20 minutes into the ride, I'm starting to eat something. I'm starting to give my body just a little bit of fuel to start that digestive process. And from there, I'll be sure to eat, maybe every 30 to 45 minutes or so after that. So staying very consistent with it. And that is the best way to fuel yourself consistently, especially when we're talking about doing big rides. And big rides aren't the only rides that we need to be making these nutrition considerations for. My rule for myself is any ride 2 hours or over. And part of that is based on science, and part of that is just based on I train a lot. And so I don't ever want to be in a deficit day after day, week after week. That can be a dangerous place to be. So my rule is any ride over 2 hours. And the scientific reason for that is that, even with very trained people, we only have roughly 2 hours of glycogen stored in our muscles. So once those 2 hours are up, your body is going to start to get really desperate for energy if it doesn't have food in your system that it can rely on. So 2 hours is kind of the rule of thumb that I try to follow. If I'm training a lot, chances are you'll find me eating on every single ride that I do. Probably the shortest rides or the shortest commutes that I do would be around an hour. And if it's a heavy volume training period, you'll find me eating on all of those rides and carrying food on all of those rides. Carrying food in and of itself can be an additional challenge. How do we find foods that are packable, that can be transported easy? So the transportation considerations for how we fuel ourselves are very important on a bicycle. What we want to look for is food that is lightweight. We want food that doesn't take up too much space. We would prefer things that have a long shelf life, things that don't spoil while we're out on the bike. For transporting foods, processed foods can really be your friend. Things that get very packable would be those meal replacement powders that we talked about. Things like Pop-Tarts and packaged processed foods. These things will last literally forever, and they're incredibly, incredibly calorie dense. So processed foods in this setting where we are being very active and we need food that's going to last a long time, processed foods can be a huge, huge advantage. So as we're pursuing this goal of healthy eating and taking care of our body, we need those calories. And if we have to make some less than ideal choices in order to get those calories, this is the time to do it. When you're being active is the time to do it. Just to back up and, think about portability of food and how processed foods can be a huge, huge advantage. If you carried, let's say, a 14-ounce sweet potato cooked. I love taking sweet potatoes on rides sometimes, but they take up a huge amount of room and they're very heavy. A 14-ounce sweet potato has about 350 calories. A 14-ounce bag of gummy candy has about 1,400 calories. So we can see the advantage there. Almost a 3.5 times increase in the energy content of those foods at the same weight. Very briefly, I just want to go through a list of foods that I turn to very regularly when I ride. These are things that work super well for me. They check a lot of these boxes that we've been talking about. They meet basal requirements, mineral requirements, energy expenditure requirements, and a lot of them are very packable. I will include this list in the podcast notes. So if you want to kind of have this and just sort of look at it, copy, paste it, start to experiment with some of these foods yourself. So rice bars, meal replacement powders, peanut butter and honey sandwiches. Maybe we're doing the sprouted grain bread if we're trying to be a little bit more health, basal requirement focused. Or maybe we're doing like a processed white bread if we're trying to be more energy expenditure focused. Fresh fruit, bananas, apples, dried fruit can be great. Has all the moisture taken out of it, much more packable, much lighter. Also very high in fiber, so something to look out for, not something you want to fuel off of predominantly. Cooked sweet potato, Pop-Tarts, gummy candy, chips, maple syrup, beef jerky, donuts or other baked goods or pastries, soda, and coffee with sugar and milk. And coffee itself doesn't really fulfill any of the requirements. It doesn't really benefit us in any way that we've been talking about throughout this episode. But for those of us who drink coffee, it's tough to imagine a world cycling where you're not implementing coffee into your rides. So coffee is definitely something I turn to, and maybe at a future time, we'll talk a little bit about caffeine and how that can benefit or deter our performance. So maybe it would be a good idea to devote an episode to that. All those foods I just listed, it took me years of experimenting to find foods that work for me consistently. And that would be the last thing that I would encourage everybody to do when they're thinking about nutrition is put time into experimenting and find what works for you. Every body is unique, and the way people handle food is unique. So put some time into finding things that work and put some time into finding things that don't work. I would recommend doing that mostly within your training rides, experimenting on big rides. If you try something that doesn't work, that could be a much more negative experience. So as you're training, as you're just riding around locally, really start experimenting with foods and see what works for you. That's going to be the best way to build a connection with nutrition. And through that, building a connection with bigger rides and better training outcomes.